Imagine being born already old. Not metaphorically old, not old in the way we speak of wise children who seem to carry a quiet gravity beyond their years. Truly, cosmically old. Born with the weight of 10,000 years pressing against the inside of your skull, voices you cannot silence, faces you have never seen but somehow recognize, desires you did not choose but cannot escape. This is not a nightmare you wake from. This is the only waking you have ever known. Her name was Alia Atreides. History would remember her as Saint Alia of the Knife, warrior child of the desert Messiah, goddess of the Fremen. But beneath that holy title, beneath the shrine and the incense and the prayers offered in her name, something far older and far more terrible was quietly eating her alive from the inside out. She was what the Bene Gesserit called an abomination. And the horror of that word, when you understand what it truly means, is not that it was cruel, it is that it was accurate. To understand what destroyed Alia Atreides, we cannot begin at her fall. We must begin at the very moment she was made. The year was 10,191, according to the guild calendar. In a cave beneath the desert surface of Arrakis, among the Fremen who had sheltered the exiled House Atreides, Lady Jessica, Bene Gesserit trained concubine to Duke Leto Atreides, sat before the Reverend Mothers of Sietch Tabr and made a choice that would fracture the future. She drank the water of life. The water of life is not a metaphor. It is the bile of a drowned sandworm, a substance so violently toxic that it can kill an untrained human being within seconds. The Reverend Mothers of the Bene Gesserit transform it through an act of internal biochemical will, changing the poison into something else entirely, something that opens the locked rooms of the unconscious mind and allows access to what they call other memory. The memories of every female ancestor in an unbroken line stretching back across thousands of years. A vast internal chorus of women reaching back through centuries the history books had long since forgotten. Only trained Reverend Mothers attempt this transformation. Only women who have spent years building the mental fortifications necessary to house that ocean of voices without drowning in them. Jessica was trained, but Jessica was also pregnant. She did not intend what happened. She could not have fully understood what would happen. But the moment the water of life touched her blood, the moment her Bene Gesserit awareness blazed open into the full flood of other memory, that awakening did not stay contained within her own body. It crossed the placental barrier. It poured into the developing mind of the child she carried. And in that instant, Alia Atreides was no longer simply a fetus. She became something that had never existed before in quite the same way. Being fully aware, fully conscious, with a complete library of Bene Gesserit ancestral memory downloaded into a mind that had not yet drawn its first breath. Think for a moment about what that actually means. Not in the abstract, but concretely. Every person who has ever lived carries within their cells a biological record of their ancestry. The Bene Gesserit, through generations of breeding and training, had learned to access this record through a ritualized gateway, a controlled opening under conditions of preparation and mental discipline. They could walk into that library, examine its contents, and walk back out. They retained their own identity because they had an identity to return to. They had a self that was already established, already defended, already fully formed. Alia had none of that. She was not yet formed. She was still becoming. And into that soft, undefended, half-formed consciousness poured the totality of other memory. Not a single ancestor, not a curated selection, all of them, thousands upon thousands of lives. Men and women whose names no living person remembered. Warriors and priests and poisoners and lovers and mothers and murderers. Every joy and every cruelty that had passed through the Atreides and Bene Gesserit lines across unimaginable centuries. When Alia was born into the physical world, she arrived already ancient. The Fremen who first encountered her were disturbed in a way they could not fully articulate. Here was an infant, small and round-faced, and physically fragile in the way all infants are. And yet her eyes were wrong. They were the spice blue of the desert-adapted Fremen, yes. But the way those eyes moved, the way they tracked, the way they settled on a person and seemed to be evaluating rather than simply perceiving. It was the gaze of someone very old, residing in a body that had not yet learned to walk. The Fremen called her the preborn. They were frightened of her, even as they revered her. And that dichotomy, that simultaneous worship and terror, would define Alia's entire existence. She grew into a girl who could quote philosophy before she could reliably hold a cup, who could discuss the intricacies of the Butlerian Jihad and the fall of the Carino Empire, while other children her age were learning their letters, who demonstrated combat awareness that should have been physically impossible given her size and her years, who spoke sometimes in voices that were not quite her own, in cadences and vocabularies that seemed to belong to another century entirely. The Bene Gesserit had a word for what she was. They had always had a word for it because they had always feared it. Abomination. Not a condemnation born of cruelty, a clinical warning, a category for a specific kind of catastrophe. The preborn who gained other memory without the protection of a formed self. Without the walls that normal human development builds slowly, year by year, to keep the inner world separate from the outer. The self that says, I am I, and you are not me, no matter how loudly you speak inside my head. Alia had no such walls. She had never been given the chance to build them. And that absence, that single architectural flaw in the structure of her consciousness, was the door through which everything terrible would eventually walk. Now, to understand the specific horror of what Alia faced, you need to understand what other memory actually is, and why the Bene Gesserit treated it with both reverence and extreme caution in equal measure. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood had spent thousands of years pursuing a singular project, the perfection of human consciousness through selective breeding and rigorous training. Their breeding program was designed to produce, eventually, a male Reverend Mother, a being who could access not only the female lines of other memory, but the locked male lines as well. A Kwisatz Haderach, the shortening of the way, a supreme human instrument who would stand at the intersection of all possible human pasts. But along the way, they had developed something extraordinary. They had discovered that the right combination of biology and training allowed a Reverend Mother to access the genetic memories stored in her cells, not metaphorically, not as vague intuitions, as full, detailed, experiencing personalities, ancestors who could speak, who could advise, who could demonstrate techniques and share lived experiences directly, rather than through the slow distortion of cultural transmission. Imagine having access to the full experiential memory of a master diplomat from 400 years ago, or the combat instincts of a warrior woman who had fought in wars your history books had never recorded. This was what other memory offered. This was why the Reverend Mothers were so formidable across such a vast range of capabilities. But the Reverend Mothers were protected by something Alia fundamentally lacked. They were protected by the fact that they came into other memory as adults, as trained adults, with a lifetime of self-definition behind them. They knew who they were, and when they entered the internal landscape of ancestral memory, they entered it as explorers with a clear map back to themselves. More than that. The Bene Gesserit training included specific psychological disciplines for managing the voices of other memory. Techniques for quieting them, for holding them at a respectful distance, for preventing any single ancestral persona from achieving what they called dominance. The inner landscape was treated like a court in which the living practitioner was always the sovereign. The ancestors could advise and demonstrate and illuminate, but they could not rule. Alia had none of this training. She had the memories, but not the methodology for managing them. She had the voices without the tools for silencing them. And crucially, she had those voices at an age when the boundary between self and other had not yet solidified. When children in ordinary circumstances cannot always clearly distinguish where their own feelings end and the feelings of the people around them begin. For Alia, that boundary was not merely blurred. It was, in certain critical ways, structurally absent. Imagine the internal landscape as a vast hall filled with thousands of figures, all of them pressing forward, all of them carrying their own desires and memories and personalities, all of them with some claim to the body they inhabited through the unbroken chain of genetic descent. And somewhere in that hall, small and technically sovereign, but practically overwhelmed, a child trying simply to be herself. For years, Alia managed. This is important to acknowledge, because the temptation is to treat her as simply a doomed vessel from the moment of her awakening, and that would miss something essential. She was genuinely powerful, genuinely formidable. In the years of Paul's rule on Arrakis, she served as a figure of real authority, demonstrating combat skill that baffled trained soldiers, political acuity that intimidated experienced players, and a personal charisma that the desert people responded to with something close to awe. She was also genuinely strange and genuinely frightening to those who observed her closely. Her brother Paul, who himself walked in prescience and understood altered consciousness better than almost any other living being, was aware of what his sister carried and what it cost her. He could see in her eyes sometimes the flicker of something old and not entirely hers. He loved her and he feared for her, though the crushing weight of his own prophetic burden left him little capacity to do what that fear demanded. And then Paul walked into the desert, and Alia was left alone. It was in the years following Paul's disappearance, in the years of Regency, that the internal pressures Alia had been managing through sheer force of will began to produce cracks. And into those cracks, one particular voice began to push with something very much like purpose. Vladimir Harkonnen was, in any objective assessment, one of the most comprehensively terrible human beings in the long and terrible history of the Imperium. He was brilliant and relentlessly cruel, a man who had elevated exploitation into an art form and sadism into a management philosophy. He had ordered the destruction of House Atreides. He had persecuted the Fremen of Arrakis for generations. He had treated human beings as instruments to be used and discarded with a casual thoroughness that spoke not of anger, but of a total and considered absence of any moral framework that did not center his own appetites. He was also through a line that had been deliberately concealed by the Bene Gesserit, Jessica's father, which made him Alia's grandfather. This particular inheritance, this specific presence in the genetic record, was not accidental. The Bene Gesserit had created it. As part of their breeding program, they had arranged for a daughter to be born to the Baron, a daughter who would be trained as a Bene Gesserit agent and placed in the household of the Duke they were cultivating. The Baron never knew of this daughter. Jessica never knew the full truth of her parentage until it was revealed through the flood of other memory. And Alia, born with that same other memory already inside her, knew the Baron from the very beginning, not as a distant historical figure, as a presence, as a voice in the hall. Among all the thousands of ancestral figures that populated Alia's internal landscape, the Baron occupied a unique and profoundly dangerous position. He was recent in genetic terms, close. His personality had not been diffused and softened by the centuries of transmission that muted more distant ancestors. He was vivid, he was loud, and he was exactly the kind of predatory, dominating intelligence that looks at a vulnerable space and immediately begins to calculate how to fill it. The Bene Gesserit had always warned that the specific danger to abominations was not other memory in general. It was the possibility that a single powerful ancestor would recognize the preborn's vulnerability and seize the opportunity to move from voice to controller, to shift from tenant to landlord, to slowly, insidiously, over months and years, replace the host personality with their own. This is what the Baron did to Alia, not in a single violent assault, in something far more disturbing, in something that had the patience and the elegance of a long siege. In the earliest stages, it was subtle enough that Alia herself may not have fully recognized what was happening. When she was tired, when she was frightened, when the burden of Regency pressed down on her with its full unforgiving weight, a voice would offer comfort, clarity, a way of seeing a political situation that removed the emotional complexity and reduced it to simple questions of leverage and advantage. a perspective that was, she would find herself thinking, useful. The Baron never announced himself. He did not present himself as an enemy to be resisted. He presented himself as a resource, as the one ancestor in that vast hall who truly understood power, who had genuinely operated at the highest levels of interstellar politics, who had no sentimental illusions about how the game was played, and who paid what price for which outcomes. He positioned himself as the one voice in Alia's head that was being honest with her, when everyone else was flattering or manipulating or simply afraid. And because Alia was genuinely isolated, genuinely surrounded by the specific loneliness of a goddess who could not fully trust anyone around her, this voice found purchase. The trades the Baron offered were simple and consistent. Order for chaos. Certainty for confusion. A clear path forward where before there had been an agonizing tangle of competing loyalties and obligations. All he asked in return were small concessions. A decision made his way rather than hers. A cruelty that felt, when she examined it, more like pragmatism. A pleasure that felt, when she indulged it, more like deserved relief from an unbearable burden. And this is where the horror becomes genuinely philosophical. Because at what point does a voice in your head that you choose to listen to become a voice that is making the choices? At what point does adopting a perspective become being consumed by it? At what point does the woman who opened the door cease to be the woman who answers it? Alia began to exhibit appetites that disturbed the people closest to her, a coarseness that had not been there before. A delight in certain kinds of political cruelty that went beyond calculation into something that looked uncomfortably like enjoyment. A tendency, when she thought herself unobserved, to adopt physical mannerisms that those who had known the Baron from the historical records found deeply unsettling. The way she sat, the way she ate, a certain quality of attention when she sensed weakness in someone standing before her, something acquisitive and cold. Her lover, the Ghola Duncan Idaho, began to see it and was frightened by what he saw. Duncan had been created through the Tleilaxu Ghola process, his cells harvested from the original Duncan Idaho who had died in service to the Duke Leto Atreides and grown into a new body with recovered memories. He was an extraordinary being, ancient instincts and deep loyalties, housed in a form that was functionally new. He and Alia had found in each other something that might, in a less fractured version of their circumstances, have been a genuine and stable love. But Alia could not be stable, and she could not give Duncan the transparency that genuine intimacy requires, because to be transparent with Duncan would have been to allow him to see the Baron behind her eyes. And she was not yet ready to admit fully to herself what was happening to her, let alone confess it to the man who stood before her trying to love whatever she was becoming. The Atreides bloodline was being hollowed out from within, not by external enemies, though there were plenty of those, by the most intimate possible betrayal, by the genetic inheritance of the one man who had dedicated his life to the destruction of everything the Atreides name represented. Whew. And through it all, Alia governed, she administered. She gave audiences and issued proclamations and maintained the structures of Paul's empire with a surface competence that made the corruption underneath difficult for most observers to see until it had progressed far beyond any easy remedy. The Arakeen court under Alia's regency was a place of genuine political complexity and genuine spiritual power, and also, increasingly, a place of fear. The fear was not the simple fear of an arbitrary tyrant, though it contained elements of that. It was a more specific and more unsettling fear. The fear of those who have begun to suspect that the person giving the orders is not entirely the person she appears to be. Alia's role as religious regent placed her at the center of an empire built on the messianic transformation her brother had enacted. The Fremen revered her. The priesthood that had grown up around Paul's jihad acknowledged her authority as sister to the God Emperor. She presided over rituals that millions of people across multiple star systems participated in as sacred acts. She was in the formal apparatus of the transformed Imperium, something very close to divine, and she was coming apart. The paranoia was perhaps the most obvious external symptom. A ruler in her position had genuine reasons for suspicion. There were real conspiracies against her, real factions within the court and within the priesthood who questioned her fitness, who were positioning for a transition of power, who made their quiet calculations about timing and succession. But the paranoia that gripped Alia had exceeded any proportional response to real threats and entered the territory of something pathological. She saw betrayal everywhere because the Baron's perspective, now increasingly dominant in her inner landscape, saw relationships as fundamentally defined by power and nothing else. Everyone was either useful or threatening. Loyalty was a temporary condition maintained by incentive and fear. Affection was a performance concealing calculation. These were not Alia's values. These were the Baron's. But the boundary between what she believed and what the voice in her head insisted was becoming, day by day, harder to locate. The relationship with Duncan, Idaho, was perhaps the most painful manifestation of this erosion. He loved her. And he watched what he loved with a growing terror that he lacked the specific vocabulary to name. The Tleilaxu had not briefed him on abomination theory when they grew his new body from the cells of the man who had once given his life without hesitation for the Duke of Arrakis. He knew only that something was wrong with the woman he had chosen, and that the wrongness was growing, and that he could not reach through it to whatever it was that he had originally found in her. Her relationship with her niece and nephew, Ghanima and Leto II, added another layer of anguish to her situation. They were also preborn, also bearing the full burden of other memory. But they had done something Alia had failed to do. They had found each other in their shared vulnerability. They had developed, through their twin bond and through a specific psychological discipline, a way of managing the internal voices that Alia had never had access to. They had named their ancestral presences, categorized them, established clear protocols for when and how those voices could speak and where they could not go. They had, in essence, built the walls that Alia had been born without. Alia resented them for this, or rather, the Baron resented them, and Alia, who was increasingly the Baron, resented them too. Because their success was a demonstration of her failure, because their intact identities were a mirror in which her own dissolution was made visible. And because the political consolidation the Baron's strategic mind craved was complicated by the existence of two legitimate Atreides heirs, whose inner wholeness made them impossible to fully control. The descent accelerated during the conspiracy surrounding the wandering desert prophet known as the Preacher, whose words were drawing crowds and generating the kind of spiritual instability that strikes at the very foundation of a religious empire. The Preacher moved with a grace and carried a political insight that pointed unmistakably toward one origin for anyone with eyes to see clearly. But acknowledging that origin would have required Alia to confront questions she was not equipped to face about authority, about legitimacy, about what she had become in the absence of the brother who had once grounded her in something outside the chaos of her own mind. She could not confront those questions. The Baron would not permit it. Every time her genuine self tried to surface and look clearly at what was happening, the Baron's voice would smother it with a seductive certainty that sentiment was weakness and that clarity required the willingness to be absolutely ruthless. The court around her watched and calculated and feared. Stilgar, who had known her since she was a toddler in the Sietch and had loved her with a warrior's uncomplicated devotion, struggled to reconcile the holy woman he had helped protect with the creature who now wore her face. He had no framework for what was occurring. What he was seeing might have fit the Fremen understanding of possession perfectly if he had been willing to apply it. He was not, because acknowledging what Alia had become would have required him to act on that acknowledgement. And the political and personal costs of such action were more than most men were prepared to pay. And so she continued, regent of a fractured empire, goddess of a compromised faith, a woman who was less and less herself with every passing week, ruling over millions of people who believed they were being guided by a saint. The Bene Gesserit had a clinical understanding of what happened to abominations in the terminal stages. It was not quick, and it was not, in their estimation, avoidable once the possession had reached a certain threshold of integration. The ancestral voice, having consolidated its dominance, would begin to push the original personality toward the margins with increasing aggression. Not because the possessing ancestor wanted to destroy the host precisely, but because any body with two competing sovereigns must eventually resolve the question of which one controls it. And the one with 3,000 years of patience had certain structural advantages over the one who had only ever been given a single human lifetime to work with. The terminal phase was characterized by a specific kind of fracture, moments of complete clarity, when the original host personality would surface in something like its original form, horrified by what it found itself surrounded by and what it had been doing in the time it could not fully account for. These moments were among the most agonizing aspects of the Abomination's fate, because they were long enough for genuine awareness to form, but too short, and the host too weakened for that awareness to produce any lasting change. They were windows that opened briefly onto a burning room and then closed again. Alia had those moments. Think about what it means to have windows in your own mind that are not yours to open or close, to see clearly, with full intelligence and full feeling, the precise nature of your situation. To recognize the faces around you, to remember who you once were and what you once valued, and then to feel that clarity begin to recede again, like a tide going out, pulling back into the deeper water of someone else's personality, leaving you stranded on an interior shore that grows smaller and less accessible with every repetition. This is what the clinical language of the Bene Gesserit could describe, but never fully convey. The terror was not simply in the possession. It was in the lucid intervals, in the knowing. The cosmic dimension of Alia's tragedy, the dimension that elevates it beyond simple horror into something that reads as genuine philosophical catastrophe, lies in what she represents in the architecture of Frank Herbert's universe. Herbert was deeply preoccupied throughout his writing life with the dangers of surrendering personal consciousness to external systems of authority, however powerful, however compelling, however apparently benevolent. The Dune saga as a whole can be read as an extended meditation on why human beings should never entirely give over their inner sovereignty to any leader, any religion, any ideology, any institution. Paul's tragedy was the tragedy of a hero whose prescient certainty produced a jihad that killed billions of people who never asked to be saved. Alia's tragedy was a different kind of warning, but closely related in its architecture. She was the product of an institution's hubris. The Bene Gesserit had spent 10,000 years manipulating the genetics and the histories and the reproductive choices of humanity, all in service of a singular project they believed was worth whatever it cost. They had placed the Baron in Jessica's bloodline with a specific breeding goal in mind. They had trained Jessica in techniques they knew carried catastrophic risk if applied to a pregnant woman without full knowledge and full consent. They had created conditions in which Alia's existence was essentially inevitable once the wheels they had set in motion began to turn. And then they had looked at what emerged from those conditions and named it Abomination and washed their hands of it with the serene efficiency of people who have never had to personally inhabit the consequences of their designs. The horror is not only what the Baron did to Alia. It is that the Bene Gesserit made Alia possible and then made Alia disposable. The end came in the way that terminal possessions always ended, according to the clinical categories the sisterhood had developed across centuries of watching this particular catastrophe play out. The host, in a moment of recovered clarity, makes a final choice that the possessing voice cannot prevent. Because there is one door the original self can always open, even in the advanced stages of dissolution. The door that goes only one way. The door that ends the siege by ending the thing the sieges fought over. Alia had a moment of full clarity near the end of her regency, as the political structures she had spent years holding together were fragmenting in ways that the Baron's cold strategy could not arrest. Her nephew Leto II had by this point already begun the process that would in time make him the God Emperor of a new age. A transformation so radical it would render him physically alien to any human standard. The world the Baron had schemed toward was already becoming one he could not rule, even if he won his war completely. Alia found herself at a window. Not a metaphorical window, a physical one. High in the fortress of Arrakeen, with the desert wind moving in from the south and the city spread out below and the sky above holding the particular quality of late afternoon light that falls only on desert worlds. And in that moment, whatever remained of the self that had once been a strange and ancient child in the warren of a Fremen sietch, the self that had run through the pre-dawn dark with a crysknife in her hand, the self that had once looked into her brother's eyes and recognized in him another lonely intelligence, surrounded by the weight of what it knew. That self made its final and irreversible choice. She jumped. Not in despair, exactly. Not as a defeat, exactly. As the only form of sovereignty left to her. As the one act that remained genuinely hers to perform. In choosing the manner of her ending, Alia denied the Baron the total victory he had been calculating toward across years of patient siege. The house could burn, he would not rule it. And we are left, after the horror and the grief and the long consideration of what her story means, with a question that Herbert placed at the center of his universe and refused to resolve for us neatly. What do we owe to consciousness? What do we owe to a self that is assembled from the material of others, shaped by forces it did not choose, haunted by voices it inherited rather than invited? Is Alia to be condemned for what she became, or mourned for what she was never allowed to remain? The Bene Gesserit cataloged abominations and warned against them, and developed protocols for identifying the threat they represented. But they never, in any of their voluminous internal records, produced a serious reckoning with the role their own program played in creating the conditions for abomination. The hubris that ran through their entire enterprise, the serene certainty that they were the appropriate managers of humanity's genetic destiny, was never genuinely examined. It was the one variable they refused to submit to their otherwise rigorous analysis. Alia Atreides was born with 1 billion voices in her head. She managed them for years through will alone, with no training and no support and no institutional framework designed to help her survive what had been done to her before she was born. She governed an empire. She loved people, imperfectly but genuinely, for as long as she was able. She fought for her own mind against an enemy who knew her from the inside and had the patience of the dead and the cunning of a man who had spent an entire lifetime treating cruelty as strategy. And when she finally lost, she found one last way to be herself. The desert does not mourn in the way that wet worlds mourn. It accepts what is gone and continues without sentiment. But somewhere in the vast taxonomy of Fremen myth, in the prayers offered at the shrine of St. Alia of the Knife, in the memory of those who had known the strange child with the ancient gaze and the 2 knowing eyes, something persists. Something that is not quite forgetting and not quite remembering, but occupies the difficult and necessary space between. The space where a person used to be before the voices arrived, before the walls came down, before the grandfather she had never met came home to take what he had always considered his. Her name was Alia Atreides. She was the Abomination. And she was, in the end, the most human tragedy that an inhuman history had the capacity to produce.